Welcome to Fun and Games Side Quests. Every episode is a different host sharing a video game they love and why they love it.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for listening. My name is Joey, ScoopJoey on most of the internet. I am lucky to call myself a friend of Matt Storm. I'm also a librarian by trade, and I do some Twitch streaming on Monday and Friday evenings from about 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock on Mondays, and usually 7:30 to 11 or so on Fridays. And I have the pleasure to talk to you today a little bit about one of my great passions, and that is Xenogears, the 1998 Squaresoft RPG for the PlayStation 1, Xenogears. And there's so many things to love about Xenogears. I'm going to go through a bit of a list here, and hopefully some of my enthusiasm is contagious. So the first thing that comes to mind when I think about Xenogears is the music. Xenogears is a well-known Yasunori Mitsuda outing. Possibly gets bandied about whether Xenogears or Chrono Cross was his best work, but I'm rather partial to the Xenogears soundtrack. So much about it is just perfect in terms of how the tracks match the situations, and it's, as an album, it all just sort of flows wonderfully. Just very, very much fits the sort of emotional tone of the game throughout, which I will get to as we talk about the rest of it. As far as basic characteristics of the game, one of the things that I always enjoyed and thought was really cool and unique was the battle system. Or I suppose I should say the battle systems, because there are two distinct battle systems based on whether you are piloting your gear or controlling a human character on the ground. So you have these sort of smaller scale battles where you are person to person, maybe fighting soldiers or wolves, goblins, the typical RPG type stuff. And in those battles, there's sort of a martial arts bent to the gameplay, in that you have the different buttons, the face buttons of the PS1 controller, all correspond to different strengths of attacks or different types of attacks for different characters, and you're meant to string those together into combos. And when you first get a character, you don't really know any combos usually, and you have to kind of like experiment and see what happens in battle. And you will occasionally unlock these special combos called death blows, which are move sets with their own, special animations and names and things. And so I always found it fascinating trying to explore the different combos and find the death blows for different characters. And there's sort of, in addition to hitting the right button sequence, you had to be the right level and, maybe input the sequence a number of times before the character would learn it. So that it felt very interesting and dynamic. The other battle system that you have access to is similar, but you are in your gear, like I said. So gear is a mech, essentially. If you've seen any of the art or even the cover image for Xenogears, it's a giant robot game. And so when you are in your giant robot, which again, they're called gears in the Xenogears world, you have a similar setup. You're not really doing death blows or learning combos, but each of the face buttons will correspond to a different level of attack. And the gimmick in the gear battles is that you have fuel as a resource that you have to keep an eye on. So you can spend some time defending and recharging your fuel, or you can spend fuel to execute attacks. So that comes into play very strategically as you're going through dungeons and things. You have to kind of keep an eye on your fuel for your gears, and you can definitely end up in some tricky situations where maybe you are fighting a boss that has multiple forms and you've burned all your fuel on the first form, or perhaps a string of boss fights back to back where you don't have a chance to refuel. And again, you've got to sort of learn how to make the best use of your fuel and customize your gear so that you've got the best outputs for the different characters that you end up with. So swapping between those two battle systems, depending on the kind of dungeon you're in and the sort of story beats that you're hitting, just kept it fresh enough where you're not feeling like you're doing the same kind of fights over and over. There's obviously a lot of grinding and things in JRPGs, and the gear versus human battles were a very interesting way to sort of break up what could be the monotony of the battles. Another thing that really comes to mind when I think about what I love about Xenogears is the visual style. So Xenogears used sprites for the characters for the most part, and then fully rotatable 3D backgrounds. And so it was very interesting the way those things were melded together to form consistent approach as far as the aesthetic. It's a JRPG of the type where your party members follow around in a sort of a string as you're walking around, and so that was always fun to have your party members trailing behind you as you're platforming and rotating the world to find boxes to jump on and get to a different part of the city that you're exploring, or whatever the case might be. Just very cute, sort of anime style. The character portraits for the dialogue boxes were very well done, anime style. Lots of different expressions for all of the different emotions that are meant to be conveyed. There's not voice acting in most of the game, which brings me to another piece of the visuals, which is the cutscenes. And there's a fair mixture of hand-drawn anime cutscenes that are fully voice acted and CG cutscenes for some of the 3D stuff. And it bounces between the two pretty fluidly. I wonder if I went back and replayed it if it might seem a little inconsistent or disjointed, but it was always so cool at the time, that it was just sort of like, oh, this one's an anime cutscene. Oh, this one's, the gears are all loading up and blasting off and whatever, in 3D, and so it was always exciting and interesting to see where things were going. But the anime cutscenes allowed for a lot of nuance and the voice acting, and there's a lot of emotion in the game, so that's an important piece. And speaking of that, I think the thing that really stuck with me the most about Xenogears is the story, and not specifically the events that transpire or anything, but the tone of the story and the emotion of the story. It is, at the time, I didn't know it was sort of a prototypical blueprint of, killing God with the power of friendship is the meme that we all laugh about now, but that's really what Xenogears was all about. But in that, the, power of friendship part of it, there are really a lot of deep, nuanced characters and relationships and events that happen that affect the different characters that are really very emotional and just very gripping and made a big impression on me. I was probably 12 or 13 when I played Xenogears for the first time, so an impressionable time to be sure. But this was the first game that I ever played that made me cry. It was the first game that I ever played that I really connected with the story on the same level that I was connecting with the novels that I was reading at the time. I just never had played anything that had the depth and the emotional tone I mean, it's in some ways very soap opera-y, and even a lot of cliches are employed in the process of telling the story. But man, it was just all of the right things for me at the time, and really deepened my love of video games in a way that has kept me on until here we are, and I'm 35. Just a lot of very raw and very real seeming situations, and a lot of romance. The main characters, Faye and Ellie, the sort of love story between them is a little Romeo and Juliet-esque, but very gripping and just really stuck with me and really made an impression on me. The other thing about the story, and I guess about everything about Xenogears, that really I would be remiss if I did not mention, I joked about killing God, but you could fill many hours of podcast and thousands of pages of treatise on the religious imagery in Xenogears. And in the hopes that perhaps some of you who have not played will go play Xenogears for having listened to this, I'm not going to spoil much about the story, but there is a lot of discussion of religion as a not universally good force, shall we say. A lot of questioning of religion and a lot of sort of behind the scenes, here's what's being preached, but here's what's actually being done. A lot of the characters that you play as come to terms with their own involvement with religion in one way or another. Some of it sort of casually, some of it, oh, I've been implicitly or explicitly supporting this thing that is maybe something that I should be more critical of, up to and including one of the characters, one of my favorite characters from the game, whose name is Billy Lee Black, and he is a priest, or former priest as the story goes along, who wears a long trench coat and has a bunch of guns, and so he fits that sort of tri-gun aesthetic of, oh, it's the holy man, but he's also a badass with weapons that you definitely don't want to be on the wrong end of. But much of the narrative certainly hinges upon religion and the treatment of religion, the effects of religion on the people in the world, and the interplay of religion and power. And as a person who at that stage in my life was questioning my own religion and had a very religious upbringing, it was very eye-opening and very relatable to sort of be shown an example where religion was not just the best thing and the good thing and there was nothing bad about it. To see a portrayal that was nuanced and raw and sort of unforgiving was important to me and stuck with me, resonated with me. But also, in the same way that the Castlevania series is interesting, to see the sort of Japanese take on European Christianity imagery is always fascinating, and to see it sort of alongside of giant robots and whatnot, it's like just enough of a fantasy setting where it's not getting people up in arms about the message that it is sending, but it's also got enough to say about the subject that if you're there with your eyes and ears open, it's definitely something that can make an impression on you. And overall, the story of Xenogears is a story of the struggles of humanity. It's really covers all of the bases. We have emotion and grief and love and hope and despair. Just sounds cliche trying to touch upon the themes without really delving into them. But again, I don't want to ruin it for anyone who may be inspired to go give it a shot. The story of Xenogears is just a maelstrom of religion and psychology, philosophy. If it's something that people have agonized over and scratched their heads about, it's in this game, and it's presented with a kick-ass anime giant robot framework that makes it accessible for people who aren't really interested in the sort of depth of everything going on. But really, there's so much to dig into and to love about Xenogears. I keep threatening one of these days to get the Xenogears X emblem tattooed on myself somewhere, and it would be my first tattoo. So that may tell you something about how much Xenogears means to me. One last thing to mention about Xenogears is somewhat infamous and has become Xenogears has become well known for this. So it ran into, I presume, some development trouble with deadlines approaching, because basically the last third to quarter of the game, suddenly you're in a completely different storytelling format. The characters are sitting in a chair telling you what happened rather than you actually going and doing what happens. And so there's this super accelerated, abbreviated, headlong rush to get the story wrapped up that a lot of people say ruins the pacing. I certainly think it could have been done better and should have been done better, and we've seen developers run into trouble with deadlines and expectations for release dates and things many times since Xenogears. But I just thought it was a quirk of the game, and oh, how interesting that they decided to shake it up in this way when I first played it. So you can certainly play the game without that putting a damper on your experience, but it is something to mention about the game. And in the interest of time, although I could ramble truly forever about this game, I will cut it off here and just say thanks to everyone for listening, and happy gaming.
Have you ever sat on a long commute or a dull day in the office and let your mind wander back to the days of rectangle pizza, bowls and bowls of sugar cereal, and gushing over your favorite cartoons and movies in school, and worry that those favorites from childhood won't hold up today? Well, the Saturday Morning Confidential podcast answers those questions for you. Host Maddie Limerick sits down with artists and creators of today to pull back the veil of nostalgia to talk about what's great and what we would change in hindsight years later. So pull on your comfiest PJs, pour yourself a bowl of your favorite cereal, and take a deep dive into the files of Saturday Morning Confidential. Releasing bi-weekly on Saturdays, available on your favorite podcast platforms and at certainpov.com.
CPOV.
certainpov.com.